And we're back. So, again, I'm in a mostly empty directory with my node modules and package.json. Gulp has been installed globally. Gulp has been installed locally. Everything is awesome. We're on version 4. You guys should be too. Let's go ahead and fire up code. And play the where did it decide to pop, which monitor did it decide to pop up a game. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'll go ahead and move this over here so that we can look at our terminal or command line at the same time as our code. So we've already seen Gulp saying something like, no Gulp file found. Basically, Gulp is only interested in a single JavaScript file that we put at the root of our application, and not surprisingly, it's called Gulp file. So let's go ahead and create a Gulp file. If I go ahead and add a new file, and I'm just going to say gulpfile.js. Also, preemptively, because I will be using ES 2015 features in this, I'm also going to create a new file called jsconfig.json so that Visual Studio doesn't have a heart attack when I try to use newer features. I'm going to add compiler options, target, and set that to ES6. Okay, then I'll close out Gulp file so it rereads that jsconfig. Okay, so we've created a Gulp file. Let's see what happens when we just run Gulp now. Now it says, using this Gulp file, so it found our Gulp file, that's cool, but then it says task never defined default. So that should be a pretty big hint of what's going on here. We need to, inside of our Gulp file, define the tasks that Gulp is going to be running. So how do we do that? Well, first, let's go ahead and import Gulp. This module, this package that we just imported, represents the entirety of the Gulp API. So you're going to go ahead, you're going to grab this. Pretty much every single Gulp file is always going to start with var gulp equals require gulp. So let's go ahead and write a task. So how do we write a task? A task, again, a task is just a JavaScript function. It's a function that gets executed. That's it. So how do we define a task? Well, quite simply, we just say gulp task and use the gulp task function to define a task. And then as far as what we put in those parentheses, one way to define a task in Gulp 4 is to, and this is also actually how you would define a task in Gulp 3 as well, is to open up with a string. So in this case, I'm going to open up a string default and then write a function as the second parameter. So in this case, when you do gulp.task, the first thing, in this case, I'm using default the string literal. Now there's other ways to use Gulp 4. We'll talk about that in a moment here. But the default task, as you can see, is actually a special task. It's a special task because when we don't tell Gulp what to run, it'll run our default task. So let's go ahead and put some JavaScript code in here. And come back to our console and just type in Gulp and hit enter. Now, this output is actually very interesting. First of all, we see that it used our Gulp file. We see that it started our default task. We also see the output of our default task, our console log statement. But we also see this thing. And this thing is kind of, this error right here, or warning rather, is actually alluding towards how Gulp works internally. And saying, the following task did not complete default. Did you forget to signal an async completion? Gulp, by nature, is asynchronous, and it works on something called streams. And we'll talk about streams later in this section. But basically, if you do not return a stream object, Gulp never gets notified if your task completed. And if it doesn't know that your task got completed, then it's going to kind of throw a fit. Because, again, Gulp is all about asynchronicity and streams, and it needs to know when the thing that you're trying to do is done. In this case, we didn't provide Gulp with any indication that we were ever finished doing what we wanted to do, so Gulp had no concept of when to end itself and display that this task succeeded successfully. So one way to do that is to accept a callback as a parameter to your task. So I can say callback, and then I'll do something interesting here. I'll do set timeout, and I'll say set timeout, invoke callback in 1 second. And let's see what the output of this is. So I'm really trying to drive home the point of Gulp being very asynchronous. So if I do Gulp now, notice how it says hello Gulp, and then after 1 second, exactly 1 second, it got completed. So this callback function, we could have also have invoked it directly, but that's a little less interesting. It'll just finish directly after 3.84 milliseconds. This callback function signals to Gulp that we are done. That's one way to tell Gulp that you are finished with something. The other way is to return a stream. I know I've said the word stream a lot, and we haven't really talked about what those are. But let's go ahead and look at some examples of some actually useful Gulp tasks. Kind of so before we delve into the internals of what streams and VinylFS is, or how to write our own plugins, you can get a feel for what our end goal is. So, to do that, I'm going to go ahead and nuke all this. I'm also going to nuke the callback. In most cases, you do not need to accept a callback. You only need to accept a callback if you're working with a non-standard plugin that has no concept of streams. Normally, you'll just return the stream. So I'm going to go ahead and say return, and then I'm going to create a stream. What do we want to do, actually? We should probably define what we want to do. Let's go ahead and do a really simple thing here. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it source. Inside source, I'm going to create a new folder called scripts. Inside source, I'm also going to create a new folder called styles. Inside scripts, I'm going to create a application.js file, and I'm going to throw some ES 2015-isms in here. So I'll say like let ble equals 10 class person, and we'll say constructor name, this name equals name, and then const person1 equals new person, whoa, and then we can say console log. I want to make sure I use all these variables so they don't get optimized out. Person1. So by throwing in those ES 2015-isms, we're able to determine if our code is properly being compiled. And then inside styles, I'll go ahead and right-click that, create a new file, and I'll create site.less. And for site.less, I'll just say body test color red. All right, pretty straightforward. We have a ES 2015 file and we have a site.less file, and they're both irrelevant what they have in them as long as they use those features so that we know if our code is being compiled. Then I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it public. And inside of public, I'm going to create a new folder called styles and a new folder called scripts. So our public directory is going to be where we serve out our content. And depending on what platform you're using, it might be a different directory that you might want to output your stuff to. But my goal here is to have these files compiled from my source directory and outputted to the corresponding scripts or styles directory. That's my goal. So let's see how we can do that. I'm going to open up gulpfile.js, and I'm going to go ahead and return a stream that does just that. Let's do our scripts first. So I'm going to say gulp.src, and then I'm going to say /src scripts. Let's just do application.js right now. And then I'm going to, I'm actually going to format this interestingly. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I'm going to do .pipe gulp.dest public scripts. And that is our default task. Okay, couple interesting things to note here. First of all, what you see on the screen are the three most important functions you're going to get out of Gulp, and there's really only one other function that you should even care about besides task, source, and dest. So these are really the big things when working with Gulp. Second thing, I'm returning something. I'm returning a stream. That's because this gulp.dest is going to be piped into this gulp.source, and they're both streams, and because we're returning this object, the Gulp runtime will know when the streams have finished running. Next up, I'm returning it, but notice how I do, how I'm formatting this. Different people have different ways with formatting their Gulp files, because generally with Gulp files, you'll generally start off with a gulp.source. You'll have a lot of stuff in between, in between the method chain, and at the end you'll have a pipe gulp dest. Well, notice how I say I have return, I have gulp on the first line. That's because if I did that, bad things will happen because of the nature of JavaScript. JavaScript will actually read this as a return semicolon and not do anything. So what we have to do is we make sure that we have something on the current line so that that doesn't happen. So we start off with gulp here, and then I do the dot source and the dot pipe. All right, let's go ahead and see what happens when we run this. It says using gulp file, started default, finished default. If I come over here and open up scripts, notice that application.js has been copied. Now, of course, application.js has been copied and it's not been transpiled, but we'll throw that step in here pretty soon. Okay, so we've seen an example of how to copy a file. Not that interesting. Again, interesting stuff goes here. That's where we actually perform the transformations of our assets. So let's go ahead and transpile our ES2015 to ES3 code. To do that, we need a Gulp plugin. We're going to grab the Gulp Babel plugin. So if we take a look, I have that... I don't have the npm package open, but I do have the babeljs.io doc setup guide open, and you can come here, just click on Gulp, and go down to the bottom and see an example of that. So we need the Gulp Babel plugin. Gulp plugins will always start with Gulp dash, and you can find all sorts of different plugins on npm.js. And if you're interested, you can come in here, and you can also locate it in the npm.js repository. So let's go ahead and do that. Interesting to note, the Gulp Babel plugin will pull down an installation of Babel with it when we install it, and that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to say npm install gulp-babel save dev and hit enter. And that's going to go down, that's going to pull down Babel and the Gulp Babel plugin, and which will allow us to use Babel within Gulp. I said Gulp and Babel quite a few times. They are kind of funny words if you think about them. But anyway, all right, so we have that installed. We're also going to need to install our Babel presets. So I do need to go ahead and grab the ES2015 Babel preset so we can actually do those transformations. So I'm going to say npm install. I could have done this on one line, but I didn't because I'm an awful person. Babel preset ES2015 and save dev. We're doing save dev on all of these because these are just build tools. We do not need these in production. So don't do save dev. So, how do we use Babel? Well, shouldn't come as no surprise, it goes here, where the interesting stuff happens. So basically, we have streams, and we pipe streams to streams, and that'll make a whole lot more sense in the coming videos. But just take it for granted that the first thing we need to do is actually import the Babel plugin into this Gulp file. So I'm just going to say Babel equals require Gulp Babel. And then, right here, I'm going to say .pipe Babel, and I'm going to go ahead and execute it as a function. And that's it. So again, I'm chaining this pipe to the gulp.source. The stream starts on gulp.source, gets modified by Babel, and then the gulp.dest shoves it into a directory. So let's go ahead and run this Gulp file. All right, let's see what happened. Now, you're not going to get the thing that you expected. As you see, it still copied the file, but Babel didn't do anything. And of course, that's because we do not have a Babel RC file and we're not specifying our presets. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a Babel RC file. I'm going to come up here and create a new file, call it .babelrc. And I'm going to set my language mode to JSON. And I'm going to go ahead and say presets, and then I'm going to say ES 2015. Or there is no dash, so we'll just do ES 2015. And then I'm going to come here and say Gulp, and I don't have to specify the task name because we're using default. And look at that. We already see something happen because our last one was 69 milliseconds. This one took 260 milliseconds. So let's go take a look at what our public script looks like now. We come back here, check that out. Our application.js has been transformed by Babel, and that is awesome. Okay, so there's a handful of things that we haven't addressed yet. For example, what if we wanted to create another JS file? So I come in here to source scripts, and I create a new file, and let's call this, I don't know, utility. And utility will have a class, I don't know, thing that does stuff and returns whoa. So just straight up not that interesting. But if I ran this Gulp default task again, you'll notice that my utility does not appear in the scripts, and that shouldn't come as a surprise. Because if we open up our Gulp file, we'll see that our gulp.source is just passing in our application.js. So how do we pass in more things to be processed by this task? Well, we can simply use an array. So I'm going to open up an array, and then I'm going to specify our scripts utility and our scripts application. Come back here, type in Gulp, hit enter. Come back here, look at my public scripts, and there's utility right there being thrown in. All right, as you can probably start to gather, manually specifying the file names for everything you want to translate will get very old very quick. Imagine having hundreds of JavaScript files that you have to manually do. Gulp .source provides a way of globbing, or basically a way of searching a directory for things that match a particular criteria. So I can replace this entire thing right here. I'll take this, I'll paste it, then I'll comment the bottom one down, or top, how about the top one? Or maybe move it away so it doesn't get confusing. I can replace this whole thing with a glob. That's simply going to be source scripts, 2 asterisks, followed by an asterisk .js. Now if I come in here and type in Gulp and run the default task, both of these things got put in. I can prove that by deleting them, running Gulp again, and seeing them appear again, as you can see. Okay, so the glob syntax, you may or may not be familiar with it, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but if you are interested in how you can write these globs, I will explain this one at the very least. Basically, what this means is find any JS file, any .js file, in the scripts directory, or in any subdirectory or sub-subdirectory of the scripts directory. That's what this part means. This part means search recursively throughout all the directories under scripts. If I just had this, it would only gather the JS files that were directly in scripts. But by doing that, you're going to grab all of them in all subdirectories. So this is the most common pattern you're going to see using Gulp. And if you want to learn more, you can hop on over to GitHub and go to Node.glob, which is the actual package that's responsible for providing the glob feature to Gulp. So you can come down here and you can read all this documentation if you're interested in doing anything more complex. But generally, you don't need to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and nuke these guys. So yeah, that is a basic default task that transpiles our JavaScript using Babel. And it's interesting to note that Babel is picking up on our Babel RC, and when we run Babel within code, it's the equivalent to having run Babel from the command line, which we were doing before. Now, if you're interested about whatever additional options you have with Gulp Babel, documentation is your friend. I've said that so many times in this series, and I'm not going to stop because it's incredibly important. If you have any questions about Gulp Babel, hop on over to the npm.js page, and it'll tell you about all the different parameters you can pass in here. Now, what's interesting is we haven't talked about watching, we haven't talked about source maps, we haven't talked about how to do less, and how to create multiple tasks. And I think that's going to come up here in the next video. So again, really straightforward task here. I will point out, you can do an array of globs if you wanted as well. And maybe I'll show you another bit of syntax. Maybe you're compiling JS files and TS files. You can provide multiple extensions by using the curly bracket syntax there. I guess that pretty much covers every single syntax from Gulp's glob than I've ever had to use. But we'll see you guys in the next video.